that we're going to see are white. And they're going to be axons that contain myelin. So that's really the difference between gray and white matter. Gray is unmyelinated structures. White is all myelinated structures. So if you take a look at your notes, we're on page 3 of the lab 13. I have that truth if you need. If you take a look at your notes, guys, at the top of the page, do you need a copy? I have that truth if you need it. We'll throw them away if you don't have it. Okay. If you look at the top of page 3, what I did for you is I divided the internal anatomy into gray matter and white matter. So let's label the first two things first. Last week I had said to you there's a deep fold inside on the front of the spinal cord known as the anterior median fissure. All right, there's a deep groove. We said last week anterior is midline. I'm sorry, front, median is midline, and then a fissure was a deep fold. In the back here is the posterior median sulcus. Right? We said a sulcus is a shallow groove. Right? So one of the things you need to do is when you're looking at the spinal cord, in order to tell the front from the back, the first thing I look at is this thing right here. This tells me I have the front of the spinal cord. This shallower groove tells me I'm looking at the back. You need to know the front from the back, otherwise you're going to get things mixed up. Okay, so that's the anterior median fissure. It tells us it's the front. Here's the posterior median sulcus. This tells us that we have the back. Now let's take a look at the parts that I bracketed out that are gray matter. So if you take a look back over here, we're going to label this the dorsal horn. I'm just going to put DH. So this part right here is the dorsal horn. That is the dorsal horn. You could also say posterior horn because dorsal and posterior are the same thing. Actually, no, I'm just going to change my color. Hang on one second. So we'll leave it the same. Dorsal horn. Dorsal horn. What's important about the dorsal horn, guys, is this. Sensory information comes into the dorsal horn. Right? Sensory information comes into the dorsal horn. Does anybody remember from the last 2 weeks, what do we call sensory information? Efferent or afferent?
Efferent.
A little bit of both.
Efferent.
Afferent. Right? When it comes in, these are afferent nerves. Anything coming in, whether it's coming from your skin, your organs, your muscles, you name it, if it's coming into the spinal cord or the brain, the direction of flow is going to be afferent. This area here, guys, we're going to label the ventral horn. And I'm just going to put there VH. You can label it, or you could say, instead of ventral, you could say anterior horn too. That would be okay. Ventral or anterior is the same thing. And what happens here is this. Cell bodies live inside the ventral horn, and then the axon comes out this way, and it's going to go to skeletal muscles. That's my representation of a skeletal muscle. So the cell body lives in the ventral horn, then the axon goes out, and it innervates a skeletal muscle. So first of all, what's the direction of flow? What are we going to call it? If this is afferent, what is this one down here got to be? Efferent. And does anybody remember from either last week or the week before, I forgot when I talked about it, what do we call a body wall structure? What's that term we use?
Visceral.
Not visceral. It's another term. Remember we said somatic means the body wall, anything on your frame. So these neurons here going out are what we're going to call somatic efferents. All right, so watch this. Sensory information comes in the back of your spinal cord. Motor information goes out the front. It always works this way. In the back, out the front. It's never different. Any questions on that? Then the third one I have for you, these little bumps on the side here, we're going to abbreviate L. That's for lateral horn. Okay, so the bumps on the side, that's for the lateral horn. These also have neurons. Their cell body lives in the lateral horn. But watch this. The axon goes out through the ventral horn into the spinal nerve. So it's also going to be efferent. But these go to the organs. So what kind of efferents are we going to call this? If it's going to an organ, what's the word? There you go. These are the visceral efferents. Okay? So sensory information comes in the back. Motor information goes out the front of the spinal cord. Always goes out the front. If the efferent is going to an organ, the heart, the lungs, the stomach, the intestines, the uterus, you name the organ, this is all going to be visceral efferents. I'm just going to draw a heart because that's the only organ I can draw like that. Okay, so, but it could be anything. Lung, heart, stomach, intestines, any organ, these neurons are called visceral efferents. But the cell body lives in the lateral horn. That's where it's coming from. Okay, so the ventral horn is going to be the somatic efferents. Lateral horn gives rise to the visceral efferents. Have you guys ever heard of a disease called polio? Yes. You may have heard of polio. Polio is a virus that gets into our body. Once it gets into the spinal cord, you know what it does? It kills these cell bodies over here. So now if these cell bodies start to die, there's no nerve impulses going to the muscles and the patient has paralysis. So it's kind of interesting to me, this virus doesn't do anything to these other billions of neurons, only destroys the ventral horn. So it's very, very isolated. The virus is still around. It could be sitting on our table right here, but the reason we don't get polio is most of us have been inoculated, so it's not a problem. But the virus is still, still out there. We're just immune to it. Okay. So all of this, guys, are the horns. Dorsal horn, you need to know from me, receives sensory information. The ventral horn over here is going to give rise to efferents. The lateral horn is going to give rise to visceral efferents. The ventral horn, somatic efferents. It's different. Can't use them interchangeably. Any questions on that? Excellent. So watch this. The right side of the spinal cord here has to communicate with the left side. So the crossbar here of the H, that's my neck structure, number 6, is the gray commissure. Number 6 is the gray commissure. And what that allows is the left side of the spinal cord to communicate with the right side of the spinal cord. So just to label this, let's label this just GC. Not the circle in the middle. This is something different. Just the crossbar is the gray commissure. The circle in the middle is something a little bit different. Okay, last structure, the central canal. In the middle of the in the middle of the gray commissure, there is a tube that runs up and down the spinal cord. It is called the central canal. So I'm going to paint this kind of blue in here to show you that it has cerebrospinal fluid. Right, so this circle right here in the middle, label that as the central canal, and it contains cerebrospinal fluid. Anybody remember from last week? We had the 3 meninges and they formed 3 spaces. Anybody remember which space had cerebrospinal fluid also? That was the fluid around the spinal cord. This is going to be inside. You remember the space? Big space. I'll review it today, the subarachnoid space. So this could be like a Steve Hackner question on a practical next Monday. Like, what 2 places will you find cerebrospinal fluid? And you're going to say subarachnoid space. What's that one? Central canal, right? And by the end of the lecture today, I'll give you a 3rd place you're going to find it, okay? The ventricles of the brain. So there's going to be 3 places that we're going to find cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so that's all the structures, guys, that I need you to know, and the functions. Again, dorsal horn receives sensory information or afferent information. Over here is going to be efferent information. Lateral horn is going to give rise to visceral efferents. Ventral horn, somatic efferents. Great commissure allows communication between the two. The left side has to know what the right side is doing. Right? There's constant information going back and forth. And then finally, running through the middle of the spinal cord, and I'll show you how it gets there later, is the central canal that houses or holds cerebrospinal fluid. And if you got that picture down, you'll do good on the model that I'm going to use today, and then also any questions I ask you next week, so you'll be in good shape. Anybody, questions or comments? Okay. So let's take a look at these 1, 2, 3, 4 areas here. These are what we call columns. So just to show you real quick, on the spinal cord, here's the spinal cord within the vertebrae. See the gray areas right there? That was the gray matter we did. Now we're going to do the white area around it. So this is all going to be myelinated structures. What's the first one I got? Anterior column. So let's label this here the anterior column. And then I'll tell you what they do, basically. Anterior column. What do you think this back one over here would be? Posterior or dorsal, right? We can say posterior column or dorsal, whatever you want to, whatever word you like better. You can say posterior column, dorsal columns, they're good. And then over here, guys, these are going to be the two lateral columns, right? Lateral being on the side. So this would be the left lateral column. This would be the right lateral column. So since they're white matter, what do they contain? What makes them white? The presence of myelin, right? The fact that these are white matter, that means they're myelinated axons. So here's the concept. If I took a stick and I pretended this is an axon, these would run not out of the spinal cord and in like these axons did, right? These ran in and out. The gray matter, the nerves run in and out. Here, if this was the spinal cord going this way, these axons run the length of the spinal cord this way. Let's say the back of the room was the brain end of this spinal cord, and on the other side of this board is the foot end. This axon would be running this way to the brain, right? And then the brain would send signals down this way. Okay, so the nerves that we're looking at are going to be basically on cross-section, but they all have myelin on them, and that's why they look white. So these are all what we call columns. Posterior column. Anytime you hear the word column, think it is containing axons with white matter, with myelin on it that make it look white. Right? So the columns, the neurons are running this way. With the gray matter, the neurons are running in and out of the spinal cord this way. There's a definite difference. Okay, so the horns are gray matter, the columns are all white matter. I'm not sure if Dr. Finley's going to have a chance to go over it. I know in my class I do go over some of the tracks that are in here. These different neurons carry specific information up and down to the brain and from the brain. But I don't know if you have enough time at the end of this end of the semester. As you go on in your studies, you'll learn the names of these different neurons that run up and down. Only because clinically, you guys have heard of MS, multiple sclerosis. The neurons that people, when they have multiple sclerosis, these neurons here, the myelin on these neurons have a problem. They actually become like scar tissue, so the nerve signals don't transmit to the brain properly or down from the brain. So these are the actual the pathology that you're going to learn as you study these diseases. Right? So these neurons are in the column. Anybody questions on that? Right, so these are going to be easy to identify on the model.
So that contains what?
Say it one more time.
That contains myelin?
Yep, so these are going to have all axons of neurons, millions of them, running up and down the length of the spinal cord, and they have myelin on them, and that's why they look white. Okay? Okay. The next thing I want to show you is this. Let me just grab a spine real quick. Okay, guys. So remember when we studied this guy? It was the vertebral column. We had the cervical spine, the thoracic, the lumbar, the sacrum, and the coccyx. We had said, I didn't really make that much of a big deal out of it back then, but I want to point them out now. These yellow structures here that are coming out of the vertebral column are our spinal nerves. Does anybody remember from, I didn't do it last week, I think I did it 2 weeks ago, how many pair of spinal nerves come off in the peripheral nervous system? Anybody remember how many?
32.
30, good, 31. 31 pair, excellent though. And how many cranial nerves? 12 pair. So these here are the 31 pair of spinal nerves that come out. Anybody remember, what's the name of the hole that the spinal nerves come out when the vertebrae stack together? This was the...
Intervertebral foramen?
Excellent. Or IVF. Intervertebral foramen, or the IVF. So what I want to show you is, how does this nerve form from the spinal cord and then come out? So that's it. We're going to add to that picture over here. What we're going to look at is how the spinal nerve is formed. So add to this a little bit. I'm just going to erase. You can leave your label on. I'm just going to erase it so I can add my picture a little bit. Again, you need to know that anterior median fissure to tell you the front from the back. So that is an important structure. So let's do this. Take your picture and expand it out. Actually, you know what? Let me just make it a little bit shorter. So add that. I made this a little bit bigger to exaggerate it because I want you to make sure that you include this area that's a little bit swollen back here, and then kind of add that to your picture. Does everybody have that for the most part? Take a look at the notes for a minute. Number 3, anatomy of a spinal nerve. It's formed by the union of 2 roots. Okay, so what we're gonna have here, guys, is this. This is one root we're gonna call the ventral root, and then this whole thing here, even the swelling, this whole back part, we're gonna call the dorsal root. Again, you could say anterior for ventral, you could say posterior for dorsal. I don't care, we use them interchangeably. All right, so we have the ventral root and the dorsal root. So let's label this. This whole thing is the ventral root. This whole thing here, to say here, this is the dorsal root. All right, so it's the whole thing, including that swelling. All right, the whole thing, including that swelling. That's the dorsal.